Okay, so judging by the roll sheet, you guys are all in the right place. This is Construction 144 for the spring 2013 semester. So if you're in the wrong room, now would be the time to leave, right? So let's go through a little bit of an introduction. I have a lot of repeats of you guys, so you've kind of been through this before. You know who I am and that sort of thing. But for those of you that I haven't met yet, my name is Grant Adams. I'm an associate professor of architecture and construction here at DVC. I've been teaching here since 2007. I'm just a part-time faculty, which means that this is not my full-time job. So that leads into a little bit of why am I here teaching you a construction class? I was originally hired to teach an architecture class. I have a master's in architecture, so my background is certainly in that realm. But when I finished grad school, I've always been very interested in the construction field and what have you. And I've done a lot of work before I went to school and that sort of thing. I worked on the construction yard and that sort of thing. So when I got out of grad school, I came teaching here, and then I decided that it would be a good idea to go get my general contractor's license. So I do hold an active Class B general contractor's license. Most of what I do now is property management. Stuff changes and evolves. I've done the gamut from flipping houses to property management to new construction to remodels, etc. So I'm here to talk about that sort of thing. I'm obviously here. I've always been passionate about materials and kind of how the construction process works and how that falls into the world of architecture and how that can really feed back into what your design work can be. How many people right now would consider themselves in the architecture field? Okay, it's funny. Every year the architecture half is this half, and I don't know why. Right? How many people would be more in the construction field? Okay. One of the coolest things about this class is that it is kind of half and half. And so those of you that are here in the construction realm, hopefully you'll get something out of it because you've got people in the architecture realm who are going to be talking architecture stuff. And likewise, those of you that are in the architecture realm, you'll get something out of the experience that the construction people will bring to the table, right? That being said, right, I'm just a normal person just like anybody else, right? It doesn't mean I know everything about the construction, right? My guess is at least one of you has a specialty in something, right? I've had people who have been welders. I've had people that have electrical contractor licenses. I've had people with plumbing licenses. I've had people with general licenses, right? And I've had contracting or concrete specialists before in here. I had an inspector once, a concrete inspector, come in and take this class. So guess what? The concrete inspector knew more about concrete than I do, right? And that's okay, right? The truth is that when you go through a class like this, it's such a broad overview that I welcome your input on a specific area, right? So if you know something, don't be afraid to talk about it, right, and share your own experiences in this class. It's part of what will make this class a far more valuable experience. So if you need to reach me outside of today, just grab a chair from the hall and come on in. If you need to reach me outside of today, my email is gadams@dvc.edu. My office hours are on Tuesday from 6 to 6:30. Okay, I'm specifying it here on Tuesday night because that's when you guys will be around for this class. If you happen to be around on Monday and Wednesday, I teach another class in the middle of the day on Mondays and Wednesdays. So my office hours on Mondays and Wednesdays are 2 to 2:30. You're, of course, welcome to talk to me about this class during those office hours and vice versa. If you're in one of my other classes, that's not a problem. So this is 3 units. There is no prerequisite for this class. We're in this room, so you made it to the right spot. We will always be in this room, barring some catastrophe where the heat doesn't work or something like that. It's a pretty good room. We've got a lot of sample materials, which is why it's important to be in this room. And I'll be passing out those materials so you have some actual hands-on experience with those materials. There is a website associated with this class. It's materialsandconstruction.com. If you've been in one of my digital tools classes, you will notice that it looks remarkably similar, right, which makes the administration of it easier on my end. The important thing about the website is before class, I will always post all of my lecture slides. So everything that I'm going to talk about will be up. And after the lectures, I will post video recordings of my lectures and me talking. Okay? That doesn't mean that it's a substitute for coming to class. Okay? If you miss a class, it's convenient because you can watch what you missed, and that kind of stuff does happen. Those of you that are in the working world, all right, stuff will happen. You have to go do your thing, and you won't be able to make it on a day. But if you don't come to class, you lose the opportunity to be part of the dialogue that we have, right? You lose the opportunity to ask me questions, to clarify things when I say something that isn't quite right or doesn't really make sense, right? Those kinds of interactions are what are going to get you more out of this class. So I do strongly encourage you to come to class, but everything is available online, so you can go back and look at it, right? I try to make it as easy as possible for access. I make black and white versions. I make versions that have multiple slides per page, so you don't have to, print 500 pages before class. I've found that some people like to print the slides ahead of time so they can take notes right on the slides. Other people like to take notes and then look at the slides later. It's kind of up to you, but I put it all out there so that you have it as your own kind of guide. There is a required textbook for the class. It's the 5th edition of the Fundamentals of Building Construction, which is kind of the Bible. It's the class. If you're ever taking a materials and construction class, this is the book that you will have to use, right? If you move on to 160 at Berkeley, this is the book you'll need, right? It's long, it's dense, there's a lot of stuff. The nice thing about it is there's a lot of pictures, right? So while we may have, let's say, 100 pages of reading between one class and the next, right? Most of it's pictures, so you can kind of get through it, right? The other thing that's nice is they bold and italicize a lot of the key words. Like here's a good example, right? There's 2 pages, it's all pictures, right? That's a good thing to have to read, right? They do bold and italicize all of the key words in it. So looking at the end of the chapter and kind of reviewing the key words is a good way of understanding, do I know what's going on? I do my best to cover all of this in the slides, so I recognize that it's tedious reading. Do I expect that all of you will read every single word in this book? No, right? I am somewhat realistic as an instructor. That being said, there's a lot of really important information in here, and I will certainly highlight what I consider to be the most important, but I still would encourage you to read it. If you can, try to read the chapter before you come to class, because if you come into class cold, right, if I'm talking about something and you haven't ever experienced it before, it's much harder to grasp it. But if you've looked through the chapter, if you looked at the keywords, you've looked at some of the pictures, maybe made some notes about things you don't really understand, you'll get more out of the class, right? So try to do the reading ahead of time if you can. So for example, right, before next class, recognize we only meet once a week, right? So it's kind of a weird schedule. We only meet 16 times or 17 times over the course of the semester. So there's just not that much, right? Before next week, I'll ask you to read chapter 2. Okay, and so if you go and read chapter 2, what I talk about next week will make a whole lot more sense than if you just blow off the reading and don't read it. Okay. The other thing that I will tell you, and this is probably not something I'm supposed to tell you as a faculty person, but this book is a lot cheaper if you buy it on Amazon. So I would encourage you to shop around a little bit because I think you said it at the bookstore it was like $150 or something. I don't know. What is it? $130 at the bookstore, right? I think the Amazon price is like $57 or 60 something with Prime, something like that. So you could save yourself money. There is a version that comes with like a workbook attached to it or something like that. You don't need the workbook for the class. You just need the book, right? Make sure you do get the 5th edition. There are earlier editions. There's a 4th edition and whatever. The problem with those editions is, yes, they're missing content that this edition has, and it's also the page numbers don't correspond. So if I say read chapter 2, it's these pages, you might get lost along the way, right? So that's the book. It's the kind of book, though, that you buy now and you keep on your bookshelf for later because you forget something or you're in studio, you're in the 221 Skyscraper studio and you want to look up how do these steel connections work? Boom, you go look it up in the book, and it makes life a little bit easier. So the course schedule is Tuesday evening from 6:30 to 9:20. It's a long class. There's no surprise that it's a long class, but it only meets 1 day a week, which is great. I think if it met 2 days a week, we'd all drive ourselves nuts, right? So you just have to sacrifice 1 night a week and come in here. I will not talk for the full time uninterrupted, right? So I will always give you a break at some point. I don't tell you the specific time of the break because depending on what we're talking about, I either go longer or shorter. That also gives me a break from talking because if I talk for 3 straight hours, I'll never be able to talk the next day, right? So we do have a break. It's usually about 20 minutes, so you can actually have time to get some coffee or something and stay awake, that kind of thing. And it usually happens around halfway through the class, okay? There is a calendar and reading schedule available on the website, though I just found out that it wasn't working on the website, so I will fix that by next class. So you can also subscribe to the calendar using this ridiculously long thing, but it'll auto-populate into your calendar system. If you have questions, there's a great website that I can point you to that walks you through how to do it. Okay? So the description of this class is it's a study of the performance characteristics of construction materials. It covers testing concepts and procedures, includes basic properties of metals, concrete, timber, masonry, roofing materials with an emphasis on construction applications. Right? These kinds of broad, general description things really don't give you that much. So let's talk a little bit about what my philosophy would be in relation to this course. Okay? Basically, what are the materials of construction? What are the major materials? Right? We know concrete, steel, wood, that sort of thing, but we'll get into some of the other ones like glass and roofing and that sort of thing. Right? We're going to cover how the materials are made, where do they come from, right? Which is important to understanding the material. We'll cover how do we use the materials, right? And if it's, say, something like roofing, it might be a little bit more obvious, right? But when we talk about wood, yes, we're going to build a building out of it. We'll talk about how do we build a building out of it and what are the varieties of the ways in which we can use wood, for example, right? We'll talk about how does the material reflect an architectural ideal, why and when is the material appropriate, those kinds of things. So that's a little bit of a departure from just the pure materials talk, but it also is kind of what makes it interesting, and it will help those of you in the construction field understand why those crackpot architects are specifying, I want to use this material. Likewise, it'll help you guys understand the opposite of why it's really hard for somebody in the construction field to use this particular material, right? So we're trying to cover all that information. And we're going to really try to understand how does a building come together. Right? How does it go together? What are the component parts? How do we make a building? Right? And obviously, how does that affect or enhance your ability to design or engineer a particular building? So it's a lot to cover. We cover lots and lots of materials, and it's just kind of a fast-paced course. But this is your comprehensive understanding of all the materials that are out there, so to speak. Okay? So the things that I ask you to do is, number one, be eager to learn. Right? That means coming here prepared, being excited about the material, that sort of thing. Being prepared for class is critical. Right? Like I said, if you don't do the reading ahead of time, you'll end up getting lost along the way. There's a lot of material, and it's helpful if you have some idea of where I'm going with it. The other thing that I ask is for you to be really aware of your surroundings. Okay? The truth is, every material that I talk about in this class, you've already come in contact with. I promise you, you've already come in contact with it. Right? In one way or another. Right? And so what you really need to do now is be aware of the stuff that you see. Right? You guys have all walked toward the bookstore from this building, correct? Right? At least once. Right? There's a whole bunch of materials that are right on your way. Right? You walk past a concrete, like bunker-looking thing that is the library elevator stack. Right? It's made out of concrete. It has great formwork impressions on it. So you could tell, right, by the concrete how it was made. Right? And that's the kind of stuff that I'm going to talk to you about in this class. And I hope that will understand your awareness. Right? You're driving down the freeway, and you see these really long concrete column-looking things on these funny-looking trucks. Right? They come from down Highway 4, and they go up and down 680. Anybody ever seen these before? Right? A few of you have seen those kind of things? Right? Those are the kinds of things I'm asking you to be aware of now. Right? We're going to talk exactly what those are. They're precast concrete piles, right, that are being driven. And we'll talk about what they mean and how they work in the building construction world. But I want you to be aware next time you see them that that's what they are, right? This is what's important about this class. It's being aware, right? And it's really looking at your house. Like, let's say you come home, right, after we talk about foundations next class. Okay, you go home, look at your foundation, right? Stick your head, open that nasty little crawl space, right, that smells musty. Stick your head under there and see what you see, right? This stuff is all around you. It's really accessible. Right? And that's the kind of thing that I want you to have interaction with in this class and be aware of in this class, right? See if we can move on, right? So we talked a little bit about the course website already. This is what it looks like. This is an old version. It still says spring 2009, right? But it looks basically the same, okay? The point is, up at the top, we have access to those lectures. That's the primary thing you're going to be looking at. But it does have things like the syllabus, if you ever want to go back and look at it. It has, when we get to projects, it'll have your handouts for your projects, that kind of thing. So you can always refer to it whenever possible, right? There's the calendar, right? Schedule stuff, yeah. Okay. So let's move on to the important stuff, right? You're all always concerned about grades, so we have to talk about how do we get to your grades. So we have a variety of exams in this class. We have a first exam, right? That'll happen after we get through concrete. so it's probably a month to a month and a half away. I don't know the exact dates of the exam. I'll have to figure that out, so I can give you plenty of notice for it. The first exam I only value at 10% because I want you guys to get used to the type of questions I'm going to ask, right? The type of detail that I'm going to go into on a test. Get used to kind of the format and the Scantron and that sort of thing. And if you really do poorly on it, it's not that big a deal, right? So it's kind of that introduction thing. You're getting used to me. I'm getting used to you, that sort of thing, right? We move on. We have a midterm exam. That's worth 20% of your grade, so notice it's going up, right? We get to the final exam. It's worth 35% of your grade, right? So we're ticking up. Throughout the semester, I will also have projects, which we'll talk about in a second. Those are worth 25% of your grade. And then we have some pop quizzes and miscellaneous stuff along the way, as well as participation and that sort of thing. That's 10%. And we get to a total of 100%, assuming I did the math correctly, which I think I did. Okay? So exams are taken in class on the day that they're scheduled. That includes the final exam. There isn't a special final exam time for this class. It's just the same time as class. Generally, you will have, for the first two midterms, you'll have half a class, okay? So you'll have an hour and a half to do it. On the final exam, you'll have the full 3 hours to do it. Exams will cover all the material from the book, the lectures, discussions, everything that we talk about, right? So anything in this class is fair game. The other thing is that exams are always cumulative, right? And some people are like, oh my God, why are you penalizing us for doing this, okay? The truth is, I want you to learn the material. I don't want you to memorize and forget the material. I really want you to learn this stuff, right? And if I were to set up the class where you took one test and then you forgot about it until the final, right, you'd forget all the material. You just cram for it, as opposed to really concentrating on trying to learn the material, right? So I make everything cumulative. The bulk of the questions on each test will obviously be on the new material, not the old material, right? So your best resource is to take your old exam, study that, right? Figure out what you missed and what you did wrong, right? And apply that to the new test as we move forward, right? And so that snowballs on each test, okay? Makeup exams are only given under extreme circumstances, right? Like extreme circumstances, right? You need to be here on the day of the test. If you know that you're going to miss the test and you have an extreme circumstance and it seems legitimate, right, we'll talk about it. We'll schedule a makeup exam, that sort of thing. But you have to talk to me before the test, right? These kinds of things. I give you my email. Send me an email, right? I should probably give you my phone number. Send me a text, right? Whatever. Here, if you want to write down my phone number, I'll give it to you right now, right? You can find it on my other website, too. Is it on there? 925. Yeah, 925-456-4355. Yeah. So you can send me a text there, right? I want to know about it ahead of time. I don't want to find out after the fact, oh, I forgot, or whatever, right? I want to know ahead of time. It's a big deal, okay? Okay, so projects, and I'll bring a few projects over after the break. I meant to bring them over when we were here. There's 3 projects in the class, and I do these to get you some hands-on experience with the materials themselves, okay? It's great that we sit around and we talk about concrete for 3 class periods, right? We talk about how do we make concrete, how do we use concrete, where do we put the reinforcing in concrete, and that sort of thing, right? That's great. That's an intellectual understanding of the material, okay? I'm going to ask each of you to do this project that has to do with concrete so that you actually have to go to Home Depot, buy some concrete, figure out how to mix it, figure out what goes wrong, and you'd be shocked at how much you learn from having to actually do it, right? So there'll be 3 major projects. Each project, right, will deal with one of the major materials. So the first one will deal with concrete. The second one will deal with steel, though I loosen that up to be aluminum as well. And the third project will deal with wood, right? They all have to do with building a spanning element that we then test with weight so you see how it fails and why it fails, right? They're designed to be really fun. They're designed for you all to do well on them, right? I keep increasing the standards of what you have to do because every year they do better and better. Last year, in the concrete beam, I had like no beams fail, right? So guess what? You get a harder project because I want them to fail a little bit, right? So late work is graded down. If you're not here doing one of these projects, the late work is going to be graded down. 10% per class period it's late, okay? So it's basically 10% per week that it's late because we only meet once, right? So those are designed to be fun. So pop quizzes, I'm asking you to complete the reading ahead of time so that you have some idea of what I'm going to talk about. In order to keep you honest and motivated to actually do that, I will occasionally throughout the semester throw you a pop quiz in the beginning of the class. Okay? It is not intended to be ridiculously challenging. It's meant to say, did you actually attempt to do the reading, right? So I'm not going to whip out, draw a moment frame, right? I'm not going to do something like that. I'm going to ask you an overarching question, right, that has to do with a particular subject matter, okay? So this course is very quick, right? You see the size of this book, right? You know we have 16/17 weeks to complete this book. So guess what? There's a lot of material to cover, right, in a very short amount of time. So we're going to be kind of moving rather quickly, and that's part of why I do this pop quiz thing, so you don't fall too far behind, right? I want you to stay on top of it, and obviously I really want you to do well. I want you to like this class. I want you to enjoy it and get a lot out of it, okay? So I will also ask you, as part of your course participation grade, to keep a course notebook that will help you make your notes cohesive, right? And I ask that this be something that's not attached to another class, right? So if you're taking 221, please don't use the same sketchbook that you use for 221 in this class. Pick a separate one, right? It can be one that you used last semester and you're just adding to. That's fine. I don't care. But don't make it something that you're using actively this semester as well, okay? I use this also very loosely. Those of you in the architecture field might have your favorite type of sketchbook or whatever. You can use that, right? If you want to use a 3-ring binder, that's fine. If you want to use a notepad, right, one of those yellow notepads, that's fine too. If you want to print out my lectures ahead of time and take notes on those, that's fine too, right? It's meant to be open-ended, but it's meant to keep you somewhat accountable in that you are actually taking notes over the course of the semester. I will also, throughout the semester, break during the lecture with a specific slide up that I'll ask you to draw. Okay? And it doesn't matter your drawing skill, right? It can be very scribbled and cramped and whatever. I don't care. But the act of having to draw one of these diagrams, right? Something like, say, a foundation stem wall, right, and where the waterproofing goes or something like that, right? The act of having to draw it will help you really understand what's happening and where it's happening, right? Which is why I specifically have you do that sort of thing. That's why you need paper, so that you can actually draw those things out, okay? So each lecture, there'll be at least one of those diagrams. Today, obviously, being the exception because we're not covering that yet, okay? Don't lose the notebook, right? Keep it with you, right? When you come to class, take your notes, that sort of thing, right? So participation is also very, very important. Obviously, there's a lot of you who have familiar faces, right? You guys know kind of how I operate, right? But for those of you that don't know me or how I operate, I really encourage you to stop me if I don't make sense, right? If I say something, because I'll stumble a few times and say something that's wrong or whatever, stop me and ask for clarification, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Likewise, if you have something to add, you want to talk about an experience you have, by all means, right? Raise your hand. Make this part of the whole dialogue, right? Don't just sit there and listen to me. Some of the best classes that I've had in here have been the ones that ask a lot of questions, right? So if something's not clear, please, please, please bring it up, right? And stop me. I'm not offended if you stop me and ask for clarification, okay? Obviously, it's really hard to participate in the class if you're not here, right? So you got to be here, right? It's no surprise. This is a college-level class. You should want to be here. For God's sakes, you're paying to be here, right? So you should come. That's the point of college, right? So come, okay? So professionalism, right? This is just have respect for each other, right? Don't be mean to each other, right? All that kind of stuff. So you can read this on your own, but you get the idea, right? Dress appropriately, all that kind of stuff. I've never had a problem with this, but syllabus, you got to put this stuff in, right? So we talked briefly about the whole late work policy, right? Not so relevant in this class. We only have the 3 projects, right? It's pretty hard to get those off schedule. But basically, if you're late, it's 10% per class. If you're late more than 4 days, 4 class periods, which would be a whole month in this class, which I can't imagine it would happen to anybody, the max you can receive on a particular project is 50%, right? Just don't be late, and life will work out well. Okay, so we're going to shift gears slightly. We made it through the syllabus. I have to talk a little bit about materials, because what would be the point in giving you an introduction to the class and not talking a little bit about the materials and talking about a little bit of the things that I find interesting along the way. So we're going to start with a few introduction to materials. We're just going to cover the basics today, right? Give you some nice architectural examples that you can kind of see what's going on. And then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and do chapter 1, okay? Which I know is a lot on the first day. No, there isn't a pop quiz, right? I'm not expecting you to have read chapter 1. But in a class like this, we have so few class meetings that we can't afford to just waste a day, okay? So we'll get through chapter 1, which is really kind of a boring chapter. Anyway, So let's talk a little bit about concrete, right? Concrete is this great thing. We're standing on it right now. You're sitting on it, right? It's in an awful lot of buildings. It's generally used as the interface between us and the ground, right? The buildings and the ground. And it's this really kind of cool material because it starts out in a liquid form and ends up through a process that's called hydration, chemically changing to become a solid, right? And so we have a lot of flexibility with what we can make with it because of that. And so we get, stuff like this. There's going to be a lot of pictures like this over the course of the semester, so we can actually talk through what's happening in this picture. What is the formwork doing? Why does the formwork look the way it is? Why is there so little rebar in this particular foundation, right? That kind of stuff is what we'll talk about, right? It doesn't matter if you look at that picture and you say, what is that? That's totally fine, right? At this stage of the game, I'm not expecting you to come in with any knowledge, right? We'll talk through that. This, for example, is the formwork, right, that goes into making it. One of the big sayings about concrete is if you're going to have a concrete building, you actually build the building twice because you have to build the whole building in formwork, right? Then you pour the building, then you take all the formwork down, right? So this is the kind of thing that can be challenging, right, but can also add a lot to a particular building. If you really understand the material and you understand how it's made and what it does, you can do stuff like this, right, where instead of having the basic formwork, you vary the formwork, and you give the formwork some texture, and by doing that, you end up giving the concrete a permanent sort of texture, right? And so this can be a big advantage to using a particular building. We will also point out little things like this, right, that right now you would just gloss over and say, I don't really know what those are, right? But down the road, we'll be able to say, yeah, those are little grouted caps for some kind of a post-tension system, right? And so we'll be able to point out all those little things, and you'll then be able to walk around and really understand how's the building going together, right? And why is it going together in a certain manner, right? Another example here of the formwork texture, right? This looks an awful lot like plywood. No surprise, right? So the point is that concrete takes on that kind of a texture, right? So we move forward into some architectural examples. These are by no means all of the examples. These are just a few that I picked at random, right, that have to do with a particular building. Tadao Ando is a great example of using concrete in buildings, so we're going to stick with him for right now, right? But we have a certain interface between the concrete, right, and the surroundings that you can't get with the other materials. It's a very clean material once it's done, right? And it can have a really, kind of almost a stone-like quality to it. And so we end up with these kinds of experiences. We can have water on one side and we can have something that's dry on the other side. It can have a lot of structure inside the wall, right? Those are all things that we'll talk about. Obviously, there's strategies, right, to how do you make it waterproof and that sort of thing. And we'll cover that as well, right? If we look carefully at a slide like this, right, you can see the edges of that formwork that we were talking about, right? So I want you to go out into the world and recognize all this stuff now. Right? Before you looked at it and it was a concrete wall, now you understand it's a concrete wall and this is how it was made. Right? Another example here where you can see the little formwork texture, right, and that sort of thing. And these are particularly nice examples, right? Very clean concrete, good work, very sharp corners, that sort of thing, right? Because it's a higher end building. Right? Examples like this, right? These are the pure architectural examples that, of course, I can't avoid not showing, right? So while I will try to show as much of the construction process as possible, I will also show these kinds of slides so that we can talk about, from a design perspective, right, this column coming down and intersecting the stairs and how that works, and then how would you form that up? How would you make that work, right? So you're taking your architectural ideals and actually translating it into the built environment and understanding how it works, right? We'll talk about the little things like the flashings and stuff that go around windows. Those kinds of little details matter just as much as the big details. So obviously we're starting with the broader strokes, right? Concrete, steel, wood. But towards the end of the class, we're going to get into all those little fine-tuning things, right? How do we make roofing membranes, that kind of stuff, because that's just as important, right? We have great moments like this where we have a concrete beam that passes through a particular wall, right? This is an architectural moment. Right? At the same time, we have this great pillowed concrete that has to do with how he understands the formwork to work so that he's getting a certain effect inside the particular building. Moving from Tadao Ando, we're up in Seattle now. This is the St. Ignatius Chapel. A lot of you in the architectural world have already seen this before. How many people have seen this before? Right? How many people know how it was made? One iffy. Anybody want to venture a guess? Go for it. Exactly. Exactly. Great. So this is tilt-up concrete, right? So it's a different method of concrete. And the idea here is that you're actually pouring out the walls on the flat ground, right? And then you hook that wall and you lift it up into place. That's why it's called tilt-up, right? So if we look at something like this, it's not just about the building itself, right? But it's about the fact that there's all these little lift hooks, right, that are left on the building that have to do with how do you get this from a flat ground up into place. Yeah. Not quite. It's still a form of site cast concrete because you're actually casting the concrete on site. And depending on the architect and how it was made, it could be modular where they're repeating and making the same shape over and over again. In this particular case, it's not because each of these pieces is individual, right? And you're not reusing the pieces. So it's kind of an in-between, right, so to speak. So in this particular example, I'll point it out, the seam of one of these tilt-up goes right there, right? And there's another seam that happens here. This piece is distinctly different from that piece, so you can't reuse the pieces, right? But there's obviously some disadvantages of doing this, right? We have to have a large floor area to be able to cast the walls and then tilt them up into position, right? The other great thing about this is it had a hand-applied dye that was rubbed into the concrete, which is part of how they got that nice, rich red texture, right? Another example here where you can actually see these seams, right? The architect, knowing that it was going to be tilt-up construction, really used it to his advantage because the seams happen, right, where the windows are going to occur, right? Instead of just having, like the construction or engineer's view of things where we divide these up into nice even panels, right? The architects actually played with the idea that this is tilt-up, and in those seams, that's where he's put the windows, right, which accentuates it. So when you have an understanding of how the building's made, you can really play with it, right, which is part of the beauty of it. So another example here, we can see those little lift hooks that have to do with how you're actually tipping it up into place. I have some videos of that, actually lifting them up into place and that sort of thing, so we'll see those as we go along. So we move from the world of concrete, which was a very brief introduction. We'll spend 3 classes talking about concrete, into the world of steel, right? Chances are, if you've ever been in a building like Trader Joe's or a Whole Foods or a Safeway or something like that, it's probably built out of steel, right?